When we go to work, we don't expect to put our lives in jeopardy, but some jobs have built-in danger. It's all the worse when hazards can be avoided, but making workplaces safe can get in the way of production, and not all employers are willing to sacrifice profit for safety. At the dawn of the 20th century, America is a bright and shining light for hundreds of thousands of immigrants dreaming of a better life. By 1911, nothing symbolizes that dream better than New York City.
It was a period of enormous building going on in the city, hundreds and hundreds of skyscrapers going up, electrical lights coming on, automobiles in the streets for the first time.
But while there are great technical strides, workers still face terrible conditions, especially in the city's vast garment industry.
Well, the biggest industry by far in New York City was the garment industry. More than half of the immigrants moving into New York City went to work in these garment factories.
The working conditions were abominable, absolutely horrible. Very little ventilation, almost no sanitary conditions to speak of. Workers worked very long hours. 70-hour weeks were not uncommon.
Among them are Rosaria and Lucia Maltese and their mother, Caterina, who work as sewing machine operators. They have come from Italy, so Caterina's husband, Serafino, can find work as a bootmaker. But the work is hard to come by.
In America, there was not much work for a bootmaker, so he became a shoemaker. And to help out with expenses, my grandmother went to work at Triangle.
Caterina, Lucia, and Rosaria are among 500 women and girls who work at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. It's owned by two former immigrants, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, two of the most successful manufacturers in the city.
Almost everyone on the East Side had someone that worked for Triangle. A sister, a mother, a cousin, an aunt, because they were the employee of record at the time.
The factory takes up the top 3 floors of the 10-story Asch Building, for its time, a state-of-the-art modern skyscraper.
There were about 200 people at work on the 8th floor. This was the cutting plant of the Triangle factory where the pieces of the garments were cut. Some of the assembling went on. There were about 250 people at work on the 9th floor, which was the main sewing plant. And on the 10th floor, there were probably about 60 or 70 people at work in the executive offices, the sales department, the shipping, packing, and pressing departments on the top floor. A total of about 500 people.
But while the steel and concrete building is fireproof, the contents are highly flammable. Samuel Bernstein, the shop foreman, knows there can be problems, and he keeps a constant watch over the scraps collected each day.
There were bins and bins and bins of all this flammable material that they were saving to save a penny here and there.
But most dangerously, Blank and Harris keep the exit doors locked. Only one exit is allowed to be open.
We're locking them in to prevent them from leaving, prevent them from stealing.
On the morning of March 25, 1911, Caterina and her daughters travel to the 9th floor, warmly greeting elevator operators Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortiala. Amid rows of sewing machines, they sit beside Rose Rosenfeld, a young girl from Austria, living in America for 2 years.
I think my mother very much liked living in New York because I think she liked the idea of learning, a new way of life and what it was like to be in America where there was, a chance of new prosperity.
Working nearby is Rose Bernstein, who is also new to America.
My mother was a lively, vibrant woman. She had gone to night school here when she had come to this country, and she tried to educate herself in the ways of American life. She wanted very much to be a true American.
At 4:45 p.m., Lucia, Rosaria, and Katerina are finishing their last stitches. Rose Bernstein and Rose Rosenfeld are heading for the changing rooms. None of them know they are already in terrible danger. One floor below, a cutter sneaks a cigarette. Seconds later, factory foreman Samuel Bernstein smells smoke. He looks through the bins for the source and spots a tiny flame. There have been small fires before, but he's always been able to handle them.
The foreman decided when he first saw the fire on the 8th floor to try and put it out. First with the buckets, then with the fire hose.
Though small at first, the tiny flame explodes, jumping from bin to bin. No one expects this fire to spread so quickly.
Cotton is one of the few things that's even more flammable than tissue paper. It went up like a firebomb. Within 5 minutes, the entire 9,000 square feet of the 8th floor was consumed in flames.
On the 10th floor, Max Blank and Isaac Harris are closing the books when a receptionist on the 8th floor calls to warn them of the fire. Without notifying anyone, they race to the roof. Many of the 8th floor workers still have time to evacuate, but no one tells anyone on the 9th floor, including Katerina, Rosaria, and Lucia Maltese.
So the people on the 9th floor are essentially trapped in that building. They're not able to get out.
Rose Rosenfeld is also on the 9th floor.
She knew nothing about what was going on the 8th floor until, of course, they began to smell smoke and actually could begin to feel heat coming up from the floor below. Many of them, of course, ran to the door only to discover that it was locked and they could not get out.
While workers on the 9th floor are desperate to force the doors, people on the street are still unaware of the situation.
An explosion got people to look up. The explosion they heard was the glass breaking from the fire. And they see flames and smoke, so somebody runs and pulls the fire alarm box.
In 3 minutes, firefighters arrive, but they are not prepared to fight fires high above the streets. They race up the stairs, but oil canisters in the halls have exploded, making passage impossible. Katerina, Lucia, and Rosaria are among dozens trapped by the locked 9th floor door. But even the unlocked doors are a hazard. They open in rather than out.
The door opening in once the fire started prevented anybody from getting out, because once you had 4 or 5 people piled up behind the door, there was no way that you could open the door, and these were all panic-stricken young girls, some as young as 14, which my Aunt Rosario was.
Rose Rosenfeld tries the fire exit, but it's of no use.
The weight was so heavy on the fire escape from the girls trying to run down that it finally collapsed from the 3rd floor to the ground floor.
The only way down now is by the freight elevator. Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortiala are trying to save as many as possible.
The operators themselves, one of them, made about 3 trips to take women down. But while he was making his trips, the panic-stricken girls were jumping down the elevator shaft.
It isn't an option for Rose Bernstein.
She was afraid to jump, and so she gathered a few with her. They crawled on hands and knees. They went down, and she was able to get out of the fire.
But while most are trying to get down the stairs, Rose Rosenfeld takes another approach.
There was a flight of stairs, apparently internal stairs, so the executives could come down and check on the employees. And my mother decided she would go up while everyone else was frantic wanting to get down. And when she got to the stairs, the flames were already there, but she said she put the skirt over her head and went up quickly and got through the flames.
while Rose is racing upstairs, and others are dying from the smoke and heat. Firemen are fighting a losing battle. The horse-drawn fire trucks lack water pressure. Ladders only reach the 6th floor, and frantic workers are doing the unimaginable.
People were already jumping in droves. So the fire was that bad now on the 8th floor that people were taking their life into their hands, literally, and jumping out the window because they couldn't stay where they were.
It is part of a disaster too incredible to comprehend. Just after 5 o'clock on March 25, 1911, New Yorkers look up and see the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory engulfed in flames and thick black smoke. Bodies are falling through the air as desperate workers jump to certain death.
The firefighters ran up with their nets, even though they were pretty sure they wouldn't work, some of them jumping 2 or 3 at a time, and they were tearing the nets right out of the firefighters' hands.
Meanwhile, owners Max Blank and Isaac Harris are on the roof, using a ladder to cross safely to the next building, leaving everyone else to die.
That adjacent building was a law school, and students had put out a ladder, and those executives all left, but the ladder was removed when they thought that there was no one else coming up.
But Rose Rosenfeld is steadily making her way to the top.
She got to the 10th floor and discovered there was no one there. She said she saw a door and she broke it and she got through the door and kept searching until she found another flight of stairs that led up to the roof. And she determined that that could be the only way the executives left.
Finally on the roof, she sees that firefighters have made their way up the building next door and are pulling people to safety.
The one fireman who was there hoisted her up to the fireman that was on the roof of the adjacent building.
On the streets below, neighbors and relatives gather, searching for their loved ones. Rose Bernstein's fiancé, Philip Title, rushes to the scene, thinking the worst.
He was very concerned about her. Of course, they were going to be married. And he said he had gotten there, and it was just a terrible sight.
Suddenly, Rose emerges from the crowd, unscathed.
I'm not sure how she survived. Sheer will in getting her out and down. Maybe it was just a little earlier than others had gotten out. In other words, maybe she was quick to act.
Meanwhile, Rose Rosenfeld slowly makes her way down the stairs of the building next door.
Her face was all blackened. She came around and saw all these people out in the street staring up at the window where girls were now jumping to their death. And her father was out in the street. My mother approached him from the back and said, "Daddy," and he turned around, and when he saw her, he fainted.
Most of the workers from the 8th and 10th floors have gotten out, but on the 9th floor, Caterina, Lucia, and Rosaria are not so lucky.
According to the autopsy reports, they were asphyxiated, and they don't use the word burned, they use the word charred. That means that, in effect, they were burned after death. But the asphyxiation was what does them in.
The scene on the 9th floor was horrifying. They found a dozen or more bodies piled up at each of the doorways.
Workers were not found in isolated, settings. They were found in groups clustered together. It was clear that they were trying to comfort themselves. They must have known they weren't going to survive that somehow.
When it is over, it is the worst workplace disaster in the history of New York. 146 people are dead. It has all happened in just 18 minutes. The building itself proves to be fireproof and remains intact. But the magnitude of death stuns the city.
They had the dead bodies lined up on the sidewalk across the street, and people were trying to identify them. The bodies that were not identified immediately at the site were taken to the morgue.
In fact, it takes a year for Rosaria Maltese to be identified.
My grandfather, before he went to work in the morning, passed by the morgue at Bellevue Hospital. Each body that was unidentified had the equivalent of a shoebox with maybe a scrap of clothing, a burned up ring, or something. And my grandfather would pore over these things before he went to work in the morning until finally, I think it was almost a year later, he picked one box and he said this was her. My grandfather lost half his family.
March 25th, 1911. New York City is reeling from a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory that claims almost 150 lives. A cigarette butt is blamed. Ironically, if shop foreman Samuel Bernstein had tried warning workers instead of dousing the flames, the tragedy might have been avoided.
If he had sent up the alarm when he first saw that fire, if he had organized an evacuation of the 8th floor and run up to the 9th and started it there, if he had gotten that door open, those extra 3 minutes would probably have saved the lives of all the workers in the factory. Real heroes of the Triangle Fire were those elevator operators, young Italians named Joe Zito and Gaspar Mortiallo. They kept running their elevators past the flames on the 8th floor to rescue workers on the 9th. They saved more than 100 lives.
Almost immediately, owners Blank and Harris are sued over the factory's locked doors.
The owners maintained that they didn't know the door was locked, that they didn't intend for it to be locked. That was their defense.
One of the owners saw my mother and approached her in the street and asked her to please testify at the trial that the doors were not locked. And my mother refused, and she said, absolutely not.
They had a real good attorney. These immigrant girls that survived spoke no English, or very, very little English. Their main language was Yiddish and Italian. He made mincemeat out of the 2 or 3 girls that testified.
The judge ruled in favor of the employers. The employers won the case. And she said the judge had been paid off, that it had been taken care of. And so it was very disappointing to those who had testified. They were very angry with the employers, very angry.
The city is stunned by the acquittal. In a later civil suit, Blank and Harris are forced to pay compensation, but it only amounts to $75 per death. Unions demand change, and a special commission is set up to investigate. It finds that fire codes were not enforced, and precautions not legally required were largely ignored.
Following the letter of the law sometimes doesn't really mean following the spirit of the law. So yes, they had fire hoses, but they never did fire drills. So they never knew if the fire hoses worked or didn't work.
They were recommending that those type of buildings have sprinklers, but they were reluctant to do it.
But some good does come out of the tragedy.
It created a whole new set of laws in New York about sweatshops and operators who worked there. And they made changes in laws, changes in building codes, changes in elevators, changes in staircases.
What came out of that fire was the recognition of the inadequacy of the fire equipment, and I believe sprinklers came about as a result of that fire. Working hours, numerous labor laws came, and that's why it's such a significant event.
Changes are made. Lives are shattered. But for Rose Bernstein, Rose Rosenfeld, and the others, life goes on.
My mother was a staunch fighter. I remember one particular occasion when she was asked to speak to the Needle and Trade Workers Union downtown in a little storefront, and she spoke and said, "You must have a strong union." This little 100-pound lady.
She did not work again, ever. She didn't talk about people that had died. I think my mother was an escapist in a sense. She never liked to face unpleasant realities. She married, they had an apartment, and they went on to live a good life together.
The Asch Building still stands today. Every year, a commemoration marks that deadly March day in 1911.
On the anniversary date, I would go to the Asch Building and I would attach a bunch of flowers to the iron grid work. I'd say a little prayer and then leave. And I did this till I was about 30, 35.
The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire changed the way people think about working conditions. It changed labor laws and strengthened unions. But even with the advancements, some things haven't changed.
It's a way of life even today. The new immigrants, the Chinese, the Spanish, the deaf people, deaf women, they are working the sewing machines and they're still called sweatshops.
I think it's important to have legislation before disasters happen, but unfortunately our society does not take notice of terrible conditions until a great disaster happens.
Are you preparing for a real natural disaster? Or just want to have a really good camping trip? We've got a whole range of products that we think you're going to love, so come check them out in the store. Just by shopping for them, you help support Bad Day HQ and help us produce more great content.